welcome to What Now, an interview series brought to you by Michigan Future, Inc. that asks, what are we learning today during the coronavirus pandemic that will help us build prosperity for Michigan families tomorrow? I'm your host, Sarah Sherpicki, a vice president at Michigan Future. At Michigan Future, we've long held that increasing educational attainment is key to Michigan's future prosperity. But as we've learned more about what that really entails, we've developed an understanding that major innovation is needed to make sure all of our students are developing the skills they need to be lifelong learners and successful in today's rapidly changing economy. So that fundamental change to our education system is becoming more and more necessary. When the pandemic ends, most schools will look basically the way that schools looked 50 years ago. And so it's really time for us to be rethinking if that's appropriate. My guests are Pam Moran and Ira Socol, former longtime teammates in the administration of Albemarle County Public Schools. With Chad Ratliff, they also co-authored Timeless Learning. The essential questions of their book involve what is the purpose of schooling and what does transformation to fulfill that purpose, what can it look like? So I was pretty sure that they would have some thoughts about what we should be learning during this pandemic to help make those types of transformation possible. So Pam and Ira, welcome and thank you so much for agreeing to talk with us today.
Sarah, it's great to be with you, and we believe that the future of the country, economically, socially, culturally, demographically, politically, always is tied to education. And so we're really pleased to be with you today and to be able to make some of those connections with you. So thanks for inviting us.
Well, thank you.
And it's great to be back in Michigan, if only virtually. And to echo what Pam said, I've always talked about, I've spent a lot of my life in Michigan, and I watched Michigan lose 1 million high-paying blue-collar jobs back in the 80s and watched it go through that, watched the disaster that created, and got to see firsthand the need to reconstruct a knowledge economy, and that doesn't mean taking away the arcs of the manual skills that go along with it, because I always say if you want something built, go to Michigan, you'll find people who can build it. But that doesn't mean just turning on a wave anymore.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and part of our position at Michigan Future is whatever we think someone's job outcome or job pathway might be, having some critical human skills is going to be important. So whether you're college bound or whether you prefer to go into something that is more manual. But I think, Ira, your comments bring us to actually where I wanted to start, which is you really probably knew some already, but did a lot of research on the history of education in writing your book, and talk about sort of how we have a system that has prioritized an emphasis on standardization and sort of sameness across the system, which sort of fit our industrial past. But you go on to sort of critique that as the mode we should be using right now. So I want to ask you to go into some of that history a little bit, like what did make sense before and what makes more sense now. Ira, maybe you could start.
There's a very long, too long, didn't read dissertation on the history of education that I worked through. It's one of the things that I asked over and over again when I first began working in K-12 education is if these are the results we're getting and we don't like those results, why do we keep doing what we've been doing? Mm-hmm. When I really dug into the history of education, and I did that because that question of why do we keep doing what we're doing really showed up when I was in grad school at Michigan State. When I really started digging in, I came to the very simple conclusion that we would not agree with any of the motives behind the design of the education system we have. It's horrible. You read 19th and early 20th century educational writers, which is what I did for a dissertation, and these are the people who designed the education system we have, and they, the original purpose of, like most public schools in America, was what they called de-Catholicification. The idea was to get the Catholicism out of these immigrants from Ireland, so that they could be part of the Protestant work ethic. The next thing you see is the creation of the age-based grade, which was done as a filtering system. The goal literally being to chase 80% of kids out of school by the time 8th grade ended, which is right where it was very successful. That's right where America was, even on the edge of World War II. It was very successful what it did. The whole idea of grade level expectations and all of that was a filtering system. We divided up subjects because it was easier to hire teachers. We chose to use textbooks instead of source materials because to superintendents in the 1890s, that meant they could hire uneducated women at very low wages to teach from a script instead of hiring college educated males who were much more expensive. We did all these things to limit opportunities. So we have a educational system designed to maintain the status quo and to limit opportunity for the vast majority of people. And what I've tended to say to educators is the fact that we no longer fail 80% of kids is a testament to how hard people are working out in the field and how creative they are and how much they're working, because the system they're up against works against them every day. And when, I worked with schools in Michigan, I started to see right from the start where children were learning effectively, where things were really going well for them, where they were really figuring things out. And as a kid who hated school, in my K-12, actually all the way through school, I'm not a person who wants to sit in the classroom ever, it all started to make sense to me. When we think about where we're going, and I think about maybe 2004, 5, when I was working, one of the things I was doing was working with Michigan Rehabilitation Services, and I went with a young man I had done extensive work with to a job interview to get a job driving a high-low at a furniture factory in Holland, Michigan. And we went in for the interview, and here's what the interview was like. Now, remember, this is 2004. This is a long time ago. We went into a room, and there were 6 team members there, but only 2 were in the room. The others were on 4 different continents via Skype. And what they were interested in was how he would respond if he was loading a truck and they had to change the order while it was going on. They never asked him about anything that would have anything to do with something he learned in classroom content or anything else. They needed somebody who could communicate, make decisions on his own on the spot, respond to things, and collaborate. And it's one of those situations where you say, we're doing nothing to prepare our children for this. That same year, I went out to visit my son, who, or a couple of years later, who had just graduated from Michigan State, and was working for Mozilla out in California. And you walk into an office space where no one has an assigned desk. There are pool tables and ping pong tables and a 24-foot screen to play Xbox on. And an open bar 24 hours a day and all the food you can eat, and there's no start time and no end time, and you say, how are we preparing our kids to work in places like, because these are the jobs we want them to have. And so what I think we've come up against is, if we're really serious about equity, and I'm never sure in this country whether we are or are not. If we're serious about equity, we have to find a way to stop measuring children against this mythological white upper middle class neurotypical straight mom bakes cookies and drives the kid to school child, and start meeting every child where they are and giving them a pathway that lets them go forward. And that means an end to comparing students the way we do, because as long as we compare students the way we do, we're buying into the system we've inherited that we need to get rid of.
So Pam, I wonder if you could pick it up there a little bit. How do you think about what should the purpose of education, what is the utility of education today, or what should it be?
Well, Ira really roamed some of the focus on how do kids become part of jobs, careers, workforce, so that they thrive in a way that's successful in that world. And the idea that we really need to retool what we do inside our schools to help our kids be ready for the workforce. I add to that, in terms of the purpose of school, the idea that it's not just about going to work. In fact, I think that when we say that we want kids to be college and workforce ready, that we're really using a much lower standard than we need to use for what we want our kids to be after they leave us in K-12, whether they choose to go to college, directly into the work, into the military. That in reality, that I would add two other dimensions to that, and I'm sure there are many more. One is that I want kids who can be successful in their own homes, thrive as members of a family, be able to create functional environments and settings for whatever lifestyle that a child may grow into after they exit out of K-12 into adulthood. And so I think about that, the kinds of things that Ira was talking about, being able to work together, being able to problem solve, being able to make good decisions, are as relevant to people in their own home environments as it is in the workforce. And then the third stool that I see as really critical is, how do we see ourselves as part of a community, and see a community as being of value to us, and that a community that brings a variety of demographics together, of diversity, whether it's economic or social or demographically based on race and ethnicity. How is it that people really come to understand that the diversity of a community is its strength, and that as a member of a community, that the opportunities you have to contribute to the well-being and the good life of the quality of life, the good life that community members lead, is really important too. And so home, community, and work we see as having very interrelated sets of competencies that help people thrive. And as I've often said, that we've put way too much emphasis on having kids be able to successfully pass tests in school and then graduate and not be able to bring the level of competency they need to home, community, college, workforce, life, faith-based, wherever you want to go and find yourself as an adult. How is it that you have really been equipped with the competencies, the skills, the dispositions, and the knowledge to be successful?
I think that intentionality is really, really, really important. One of the reasons we came to really push the idea of multi-age elementary schools, and big rooms with kids from kindergarten through fifth grade together, sometimes 120, 150 of them with multiple teachers, was how that built community, how it built the culture of care across things, so that instead of bullying, older kids became the caregivers of those younger than them, while the younger kids could aspire to arrange, in addition to making it clear to people that no one in a room like that is behind, because everybody's someplace and you don't see it as a dividing line anywhere. What that builds is a sort of trust and a responsibility level across the board that's wonderful to see. So, we could watch kids flowing in and out of the building, on their own, and knowing that they take care of each other and take care of themselves. And, Pam and I watched this in a big way in Ireland, where they don't divide kids up by age, and saw the difference that creates across the board, including in accomplishment, because when kids are always hearing the top of the instructional period, they're picking it up in dramatic ways. The other things that I think of as we did stuff moving up, we discussed the legendary Treehouse project. It was in a very high poverty middle school where that was built on kids from 4 radically different and segregated elementary schools coming together. And the idea of saying to kids, build whatever you want in the cafeteria, and having them choose to build rolling tree houses. But watching those kids come together in that environment, all these kids participating together, kids who are often in the most trouble becoming leaders of the work, and holding others accountable for their actions, and thus changing the adults' perception of them within the building. We saw a community come together. It wasn't just math learning skills and communication learning and those kind of things. It was remarkable social learning that helped build a community. And talk about effective within a family, brought in rural parents who had never walked into the school since they had probably left there at the end of 8th grade, years before. And finally, when you got to the kind of, open creative spaces we really tried to build at our high schools, one of the projects I think we mentioned in the book, Pam, was the famous Spoon project at Monticello High School, where a group of tech kids who hung out in the library, sort of inventing things, met a classmate in the school cafeteria one day who had never been able to feed herself, multiply impaired, a young woman. They spent 6 months working with her, prototyping and developing, along with the 3D printing that they did and things like that, until they got a spoon that allowed her to eat on her own. Mm-hmm. That is everything we want from our children. Mm-hmm. And it's not like there's no knowledge or skill development as part of any of those things. There is, but it happens naturally. Kids gain that knowledge because they need it at the moment to do the authentic things they want to do, instead of the decontextualized education that we try to force down kids' throats.
Okay? I think about it, Sarah, that at some level, even with schools that have made a real commitment to, let's go to a more hands-on project-based focus, that oftentimes the project is still focused 99% on what's the content the kids need to learn here. So it's a social studies project around a particular point in history. The kids are building projects that relate to that. One of the things that we saw shift, Ira, as we started to bring more of a maker-infused focus into the work that our young people were doing, is then people started to marry some of the concepts of maker education together with project-based education or inquiry-driven learning, is that you started to have people start to ask questions such as, who's this learning important to? Who could be helped by this? In what ways could you have influence as a result of this work? And probably one of the best examples that I still use routinely to illustrate what I mean by that is an elementary school where kids were challenged to make something for someone by identifying a need. And I was invited to come in and listen to kids sharing their project work. And again, as Ira said, when kids work on a project like that, the teachers that are really, it's not a random sort of focus. It's definitely tied to whether it may be math and science content or whatever. But kids it's in more of an embedded learning process. But I walked in and this one little guy was showing off a cane, a walking cane. And he had asked his grandmother what she needed, what would really help her. And she said, well, I've got this cane, and when I'm walking around my house, I'm always losing my cell phone because I have to lay my cell phone down and walk with my cane, and then I can't remember where my cell phone is. And this little guy had designed a holster for the cane that attached to the cane so that she could holster her cell phone when she was walking, and then wherever she was, she would have her cell phone. And I thought, the design work that went into that, the problem solving that went into that, measuring mathematically, using computational skills, focusing on how to create that, wasn't just about him doing a project, but he was so proud that he had done something that really made a difference for his grandmother. And I think that when we saw teachers starting to turn towards having kids understand that self and other are connected, and that whether it's through empathy, whether it's through relationship, whether it's through personalizing, even entrepreneurship from a social perspective, that what we saw were kids starting to really build solutions and to do projects around something that they wanted to either influence in the community or a need that they could address, not just for themselves, but for others. And so we saw that as really starting to embed some of those dispositions that we think that despite all the efforts that we've made over a lot of years to teach kids to read, to love to read, to do math, to become people that use math in their own lives, all the things that we've said we want and have kind of failed pretty abysmally at by using a test prep model and a testing model, we started to see kids that never were seen in school for their strengths and their assets as suddenly emerging in the eyes of teachers as, oh, I had no idea that this person could think this way or create this way or problem solve this way. And so we really believe that starts to emulate the best of what any organization or community or home does when you're looking at working from the strengths of people and valuing their assets and what they do differently, not just alike. And that starts to fuel a whole different way of thinking about the purpose of school. Ira? Or Sarah?
I want to, one thing I just want to sort of highlight in what you just said is like the human need to feel competent and valuable is right. That's true for whether you're 8 or 28 or 68. And that really sort of serves that need and is really motivating, I think, to kids. I really want, if possible, to get almost down to like the classroom level in that example. If a teacher was listening to this, she might, or he might think like, wow, that's amazing. How in the world I'd have to respond to each one of my 25 kids and their project and figure out what skills I can build into, like, what standards can I put on the one who wants to do a cane holster versus somebody who wants to watch birds in their backyard. And so what is the practical, how do you help a teacher sort of get there to embrace that?
Let me just start.
Birds.
Okay. Let
I
me
like
just begin with teachers, educators in general have to stop thinking it's their job to do all these things. You have a room full of learners, a room full of support, a room full of skills that you probably haven't even opened the door to in most classrooms. What we've seen is that when kids are allowed to help each other, there's this radical change because all sorts of skills and competencies come out. So there will be some kid in the room who knows something more about this than the kid who needs help. And
even at age 5.
Even at age 5, this is true everywhere. And the standards become obvious to the kids right from the start. I still remember being in a middle school, what we called mechatronics labs, which is shop combined with, high-tech stuff all together, and kids working on all these different projects. But there were 2 groups that were sort of back to back in one area of the room, and a kid from one group turned to the other, and I'll clean this up, but said, "You guys better get to work. You haven't done blank all week." Kids hold each other to these standards. One of the key tricks for me has always been taking away all that we do that isn't necessary. To understand, if you watch a group of kids on a playground, or you watch a group of kids learning to play a sport together, you don't really need to see a lot of coaching. You see what we call the aspirational peer thing form. There's somebody who can do something that the others can't. And the rest of the group pursues that skill to the extent that they can. If you decide that you don't need to grade all these things, that you don't need to set up a standard for all these things, because the easiest thing, and we saw in Louisville, Kentucky, where the whole school system has gone to a defensive learning model, let the kid tell you how they did. They will do that. I went to an alternative high school where that's what we did. I'll tell you what I did and what I didn't do. What we do is we infantilize kids, even our youngest kids, when their competencies far exceed what our standards are. And so I think thing is step back. I'll give you an example of this in one of a different mechatronics lab, where all the teacher had said was to 6th graders this was a 6-week exploratory or 9-week exploratory, a very short thing. He had handed them Arduinos and said, make something. That was the entire thing. At the end of those 9 weeks, the number of unbelievable things that had been built, from fire alarms to security systems to, and what the teacher said was, if I had given them assignment, none of this would have happened, because I wouldn't have believed these kids were capable of doing any of this.
Yeah. And I think that, Sarah, that, as a superintendent and talking to a lot of teachers in the Twitter world who will reach out and say, tell me about how can I help my superintendent think more out of the box or differently or less control at the principal level. And the reality is that, you go back to that history piece that Ira talked about. And the same thing was true in the assembly line plants, that's true in education. And that is that we set up a hierarchy of compliance where any deviation from the rules was pretty much that we tried to close it down. The whole bell curve grading system is not that different than an assembly line model of everybody trying to work towards the same outcomes and really trying to be sure that everything is about compliance to the system.
Mm-hmm.
What I think that we really learned, and we learned it in the 70s when we had the rise of the Asian economy in terms of the auto industry that kind of put us out to pasture there for a little while, but the auto industry recovered. But they recovered by focusing on how do we really try to go to the employees and get them to become part of the investment system in terms of intrinsic motivation, and to move away from a total compliance driven system. Edward Deming's work certainly had some impact during that time period. One of the things that I think about is that we never put in place pacing guides in our school system where we said every teacher needs to be in the same place kind of at the same moment in time, and all the kids are getting moved through regardless of the time that they need to go through the content. Our state test and No Child Left Behind was a constant battle to try to keep ourselves providing as much opportunity for teachers to have control in their work with kids so that they could kind of pay that forward to the kids and let the kids have more control over their own learning. Mm-hmm. And so for me, one of the things that I say to teachers is that I can't come in and create the system that I worked with a lot of staff to try to continuously improve in the system where I was superintendent, but that in your own classroom where you have the space to really try to move out of a compliance driven focus and to be able to give kids more autonomy. We know from Dan Pink, nothing is a greater driver in our lives as humans than to have a sense of autonomy. To be able to frame the content that you've got to be responsible for, because you can't take that away from, what goes on in public education. But how do you frame that so that rather than you feeling like you've got to be on top of 25 kids all working on different projects and different content, how do you create a framework of learning so that you do have a sense that in this project work that kids are going to be doing, or this inquiry focus, here are sort of the essential understandings, the essential standards that I know that the kids are going to work on, but I'm not going to be putting my thumb on everybody's going to do a project on Egypt and it's all going to be an Egyptian face mask. Mm-hmm. And then we're going to paint them and they're going to write, everybody's going to write the same little sort of writing prompt essay. Because what you get when you do that is a group of kids who feel that the learning was never theirs, that the learning belonged to the teacher. So how can you, even in something as simple as that, third grade in Virginia, every kid has to learn about Egypt. And you can see classrooms where all the kids do the very same thing in the very same way. And it's the same pie plate with a picture of the, Egyptian or whatever, pyramid, whatever, up on the wall. Or you can find kids who have really dug in by setting up a teacher just asking the question, what do you wonder about? What would you like to learn? How can you show others what you learned? And then let's put it all together so that we all learn together. Yeah. And then, all of a sudden you've got a teacher who probably is feeling less stress to try to get it all done in the same way, and giving kids the opportunity to have some autonomy in the work that they do. Yeah. Things that we adults think are important for kids to learn don't seem to go away, but how we build the pathways for kids to get there. For some kids, it may be through technology that looks more contemporary, like Arduinos. For others, it may be through constructing their own story. For others, it may be through creating some way of sharing images or showing a project they've built. What I think is the most key in it, though, is that if you as a teacher can find the pathways that allow kids to be curious, to wonder, to work together, and to be able to say, when you have completed that unit on multiplication or measurement or ratio and proportions, or I don't know, Ira, what's some of the content in the social studies curriculum in Michigan? You always talk about that Michigan's heroes were the anti.
Well, the French and Indian War changed completely from New York to Michigan. That was a quick lesson I got. But I was going to say, Pam, if I could just add one thing to that, because I think it's crucial. When you give those kind of choices, it's just like when a teacher says kids are going to choose their own books instead of doing a whole class book. Mm-hmm. So when kids choose their own books, the amount of knowledge and literacy in the classroom leaps forward because it multiplies. Kids tell each other about the books. Mm-hmm. So, and Pam, you'll remember this story of walking into a third grade class doing the Rome thing. And, one kid was doing a scratch game of zombies invade the Coliseum as his project. But other kids were building things with blocks or doing aqueducts with water. The knowledge in the room multiplies because kids are watching each other. They're seeing each other.
Yeah. And the language also. One of the things that we have as a takeaway from some of the European countries, and we oftentimes talk about in Ireland, that the language that kids use, and Ira, you actually had some research from when you were working on your doctoral degree, that, our kids in many ways, because we tend to control language so much in our elementary schools, that you end up with kids that live in homes that are rich language homes have a lot of background knowledge and language that kids that perhaps are in homes where parents do not have, a PhD or et cetera, may not have built out. But one of the things we know is that all kids are capable of absorbing incredible language from the world. And in Ireland, they don't back away from really, what did you say, Ira, that it's kind of the fire hose of how do you fire hose language at kids so that they, really build that. The other thing that we really believe is that mentorship can happen in many ways and can happen with 5-year-olds or 15-year-olds or 18-year-olds, that kids can become and find, they can both become mentors and find mentors around them as adults, as other kids, as older kids, as younger kids. And that the more that we set up situations where kids have opportunities to really see what others can do, the more it stimulates kids to want to accomplish that themselves. Yep. And that cuts across kids that come from, whether it's an English language learner background or a background with perhaps that includes a disability. That what happens is that when the learning starts to feel more low stakes to kids, they're more willing to take risk. They're more willing to become playful. Ira, that's kind of your word, is that learning should have a strong play-based component, not just in early childhood, but all the way up through high school. Mm-hmm. And then when that happens, it kind of releases kids to make connections and to build knowledge differently, build concepts differently than when we're in this lockstep teaching mode. So I think my advice to teachers is look for the places and the opportunities where you can create autonomy, give kids choices, create systems that are comfortable for kids to try things that they would not have otherwise tried, and to take away the compliance-driven focus on grades or points or whatever it is that we tend to try to enforce kids as learners, because in reality, we've done a pretty poor job of creating learners. We've created test takers. We've created kids that can graduate. We've even created kids that are really good at going to college and ending up in very lucrative careers. But a lot of people will tell you that happiness in life was never about the compliance side of school. We asked group after group after group, what do you remember about learning? And Ira, you love to listen to people talk about what their high moments as learners were in life.
Yeah, they never mentioned school, including educators.
So you think about that, when Ira just said how that what you want kids to do is to chase learning. Think about that idea of the difference between chasing learning or being drugged to try to get you to learn. And what we have seen over and over again is that when we unleash the creativity of our teachers and just said, you've got permission to try out things, we want to know what you're doing, we want to know how it's working, because what we were able to build is what I call our innovation portfolio. Now, if you go back to the days of when the first of sort of the innovation labs started kicking around, and I think it was probably around World War II, Ira, where the concept of the skunk works emerged from one of the companies that was building jets, jet engines. But I think that's the right story. But the reality is that when you start to think of how do we encourage teachers to see themselves as creators, as designers, because they believe that the more that they work in that area, the greater difference they make in more kids' lives. And you start to take away all of those compliance-driven structures around them that just cause them to say, okay, I can pick up the lesson that's been created for me. I can deliver that lesson. I can grade the student responses to that lesson and then turn the page and move on.
Yeah.
Teachers are not really very happy people who live in those environments. But when you start to give them autonomy and the opportunity to see themselves as creators and designers, then all of a sudden what you start to build is really a systemic approach to innovation that comes out of being able to say, and we kind of created over time what we consider to be a logic model that starts with, if somebody comes to you with an idea, how do you get to yes? Whether it's a teacher in a classroom getting to yes with a kid, whether it's a principal or a department head, or even me as a superintendent, how do we try to get to yes? But one of the things, Ira, we learned along the way is that our old mindset was that that's an individual, that creativity is at the individual level. So if a teacher comes to you, say yes. What we began to, it wasn't new to us, but what we began to notice is that you would have in a school, and Ira would point this out when he would walk schools with me early on, a teacher doing amazing work on one side of the hall, and you went on the other side of the hall and it looked like worksheets, traditional lecture stuff, even in elementary school, desk and rows. And he's the one that I think first said, maybe what we need to do is to get these ideas when somebody brings it, thinking about how do you get a team around it? How do you get that teacher to say to that teacher or that principal or that department head, who else needs to be around the table? And the work of Frans Johansson, who wrote the book, The Medici Effect, really caused us to think about that. The more you built out team, and even diverse team, the more likely you were to get creative outputs, and that you could get from those creative outputs what's working about this. And Ira, the thing that we learned, and it goes back to the treehouse piece, is that no other schools built tree houses, but we did see a lot of change across the system as a result of the treehouse project.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's that, kids don't get permission unless teachers have permission. Teachers don't get permission unless principals have permission. It is a flowing downstream thing. And what we have to learn is that, and because I have this mixed background of education and law enforcement, I can always say this, is we spend so much time in our schools trying to make ourselves into police officers by making rules and rules and rules and rules for everybody. That's not really what we want to do. We want to be educators, we want to be learning coaches, we want to be advisors, and we want to be supporters. And that's true of all of us in schools. And so we need to back off on things. This doesn't mean, and I remember asking this about the standardized tests in Michigan many years ago. If there are things on this test that we don't think it's of any value for kids to learn, then that's a discussion we have with the state. But if we think that the stuff on the test has some validity, we don't have to teach to the test in order to assume our kids are going to get it. This is just part of what we do. It's not focusing on it to the same extent. And what Pam was mentioning about the history thing is, because I've lived in New York and Michigan and Virginia, I know in history there are no right answers. There's and the knowledge that you get by acing the history test in Michigan has no value if you move across a state line. So we have to think about what it is we're focusing on. Of course, we wanted our kids to get through the state tests because that meant the state would leave us alone. But by not making it the focus of what we were doing, our kids did better on the tests.
Yeah.
One of the things that I would love to be able to just end on is that, as we've come through the pandemic, that we've heard a lot of people say, we can't wait till we can get back to normal.
Yeah.
I think we understand that people think of normal as being spontaneous and rubbing shoulders with each other and being able to be in the room and see each other and respond to body language as well as words, all of those things. But in our school environment, normal was not necessarily good for all kids or even most kids. Mm-hmm. And what I've been really thinking as Ira and I've talked with educators across the country, is that what we really want to do is to focus on what we've learned about relationships, about connectivity, about the personal side of who we are as teacher, learner, parents, families, all together. And how do we take what we've learned from that and really turn to better versus back to normal?
If you were a principal at a school, maybe, what would you prioritize? Let's say in the fall, everyone's back. Like, what would you prioritize and really emphasize for your building in the first couple of months as kids are returning to that environment?
That's a wonderful, wonderful question, and one that we have thought about, and it's a great one to end with. I think that as we turn to better, I think that there are two things that I would say I would want to see occurring for as the highest priority in the first couple of months. And one is, how do we really build the capacity of everyone in our school community to develop relationships with each other, to really understand what it means to be truly empathetic, knowing that people are coming back from very different situations, losses of family members, to losses of jobs, income, etc. So how do we really begin with what we think is the center of everything that schools should be about, and that is building community, building the capacity of community to care for each other, to have regard, respect, kindness, empathy, and in building those relationships with a healthy dose of play thrown in, because we think that our kids and our adults are going to really need some playtime coming out of this pandemic, that if you put that together, then what you're going to be able to do is to accelerate learning forward, because instead of fighting to try to make learning the focus so that kids can recover what they've lost. What we would be building on are what we have learned and gained from these experiences that we've just had. And as Ira says, there's been a lot of learning going on. It may not have been the learning that's on the state test,
Right.
but don't think that our learning losses are truly learning losses. We've had a lot of learning gains too.
Ira, Pam, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Sarah, it's been delightful. And, we just have great regard and respect for the educators and communities of Michigan. Ira's really made them come alive in our work because there are such rich stories that cut across education, the workforce, families, communities. And so we just really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and share some of our perspectives on what's possible if we all work together. So thank you.
And I just will want to say thank you. And as I say to all educators these days, and should always say to educators, you are doing the world's most important work. Education is about a fight for our future, and children are the most important thing we do in society. So thanks to everybody involved in whatever form, and just take care and be safe.
Please join us for the final episode in this series when we'll be talking with the president and CEO of the Grand Rapids Public Museum, Dale Robertson.
So in that moment, that student was a scientist. That student asked a question that scientists worldwide are currently studying. Now, to me, that's really powerful.
We'd love to hear from you about how to make Michigan's education system work better for all kids. Please find us on social media.